Welcome, class. So today we're going to learn about the nature of groups, how they come together, what typically involves groups, and we're going to look at some distinctions as well to get us set for next week's discussion on focused interactions. So, what is a group? A group is really hard to define, and this is one of the challenges that group communication scholars have, is really trying to define what counts as a group and what does not. So, for our purposes, a group is a set of 3 or more individuals who perceive themselves as belonging to some kind of distinctive collective unit. And this unit is something that's apart from the normal relationships that the participants have to one another. So in other words, a group is 3 or more individuals. Okay, so we'll just put 3 or more individuals who perceive themselves as being part of a collective unit. Okay, so 3 or more people and collective unit. Those are the key ideas. Now, the reason we say 3 is, what about a 2-person group, you might ask? Can't we have such a thing called a 2-person group? The problem is that with a 2-person group, we typically call that a dyad, okay? And a dyad is a relationship between 2 people. So a dyad is like a man and a woman dating, or 2 guys dating, or whatever. And so the problem is if you call it a 2-person group, that really doesn't do justice to the unique requirements of being in a relationship with somebody, like in a personal, romantic, or friendship type relationship. And it doesn't do justice to the idea of what has to happen in a group, which these are some of the things that I'm going to discuss in terms of, socialization and all of that. So we really start groups at 3 people, and if you're interested in just 2-person groups, what you're really interested in is dyads, and really that's just interpersonal relationships, and then you can take a relational communication class and learn more about that. But for our purposes, it's 3. Now, there's a couple of features that groups tend to have, at least as far as how we're going to look at it. And again, there's always counterexamples of, like, anytime you define a group, there's always like some group that you can find or think of and be like, well, wouldn't they count also? And you're kind of like, well, so this is what we're going to try to work with. So the first thing is there's regulation of entering and leaving. Okay. So we got regulation of entry and exit. Okay. And these are norms or rituals or procedures for joining or leaving in the group. So sometimes these are predetermined, like if you're assigned a group with somebody, then the boss says, Chris, Mark, and Jane, you are part of a group now. So that was the establishment of your entering. And you can't just quit the group. You might have to give some kind of account for why you're leaving, or you have to ask the manager, can you leave the group? And so there is still some regulation of entering and leaving. To join like a fraternity or sorority, you have to go through rush or go through the pledge process, and that's a regulation of entering. And then if you want to leave the sorority or the fraternity, there's an exit process that you typically have to go through if you want to leave on good terms. Same thing if you get hired somewhere at a company. So there's regulation of entering and leaving. That's one of the commonalities among groups. Another thing, or another feature, is capacity for collective action. Now, with capacity for collective action, the idea is that groups work together to get things done on a larger scale than themselves. So part of what a group is after is the idea that if we come together, we can get more done than if we were to work individually and try to do it all ourselves. So this could work out in, if you're trying to produce something, like you come together to try to, help each other move, right? Your friends might call you and say, hey, can you help me move? Because it's a lot quicker to move with multiple people than just by yourself. To play basketball, you need a group. I mean, you can shoot hoops by yourself, but it's not as fun. So, of course, you're going to try to get a group so that way everybody can engage in this collective action of playing basketball. So that's the idea. Thirdly, there's usually some kind of division of labor. Okay? Division of labor or roles. And these can be formally or informally defined. So small groups might have formally defined roles. So if you're in a project team of some kind in your workplace, you might have an established leader, right? And then you might have somebody whose job is to be the note taker, and another person's job is to be the engineer, or whatever. So those might be very formally defined. Informally is where it doesn't ever get explicitly stated what you are, but it just emerges that this is how it is. So maybe when you go out with your friends, one of your friends kind of takes on the leadership role, the decision-making role, and says, okay, let's go here. And everyone just kind of follows him or her. And then when like the waiter comes and says, hey, so what are you guys going to order? Do you guys want appetizers? Maybe it's that one friend who kind of says, no, we're not going to have any appetizers, or no, you can just bring the check or whatever. So even though it's never been stated that he was the leader or she was the leader, it just kind of has emerged that way. And those are informally defined roles. The other aspect is socialization. Okay. And this is a term you may not have heard before. Socialization is a very complex term, and I'll simplify it to the best of my ability. And of course, if you take a sociology class, you'll get plenty on this, and psychology too. The idea is socialization is that we are taught by our surroundings, our society, if you will, the culture that we're in, and we learn how to live in its ways. When it comes to groups then, with socialization, there is some kind of learning curve that you have to go through to understand how the group works. So when you go into a fraternity, or if you meet a family for the first time, so let's say you're meeting your spouse's family or future spouse's family for the first time, and they have all these weird traditions and roles, and they have these little inside jokes that you don't get. That's all part of the socialization process where they explain to you, oh, we like to joke about Modern Family all the time, so you have to watch Modern Family to really understand our jokes, that kind of thing. Or if there's some kind of traditions that they have, like at Christmas, maybe they do Secret Santas or something like that. That's all part of the socialization process, the learning curve. Fraternities and sororities very much spell this out. And I was Greek myself, so that's why I keep kind of referring to them. So fraternities, you have to learn the history of the group. You have to learn all of the handshakes and signs and symbols and the founding fathers, and it's probably same thing with sororities too. So you have to learn all these things, and then once you get the hang of it, then you can start to fit in, if you will. Lastly, there's this thing called societal presence. And real quick, going back to socialization here, you can get a very step-by-step process of socialization on page 221 of your book. So if you go there, there's an example, because what Dr. Floyd does is he goes through the 5 phases of socialization, and so he goes through antecedent, anticipatory, encounter, assimilation, and exit. So basically from beginning, middle, to end. Okay, so feel free to go to page 221 and to use those terms in your video responses. So going back to social presence now, social presence is the idea that the group has some sort of function geared towards outside of itself, okay? So playing a sport, you're playing it to play against other teams, and you're playing for a city or you're playing for a league of some kind. if your group is to produce a report, if you're on some kind of exploratory committee, then your group has an outside orientation to the public or to the management who assigned you whatever it was that you guys needed to do. If you're a civil rights group, then your group is to engage the public, and that's kind of who the audience you're thinking about as you act as a group. If you're a fraternity sorority, you're thinking about the campus, the university. How is this going to look to the university? How is this going to look to the campus? So there's some kind of presence that you have in front of some outside audience that you're trying to affect. Now, none of these 5 are necessarily part of a group. Like, it's not by necessity you have to have all these things, but statistically, these are the things that groups tend to have. But, like, you may not have one thing, but you might have the rest, and it might still be okay. It might still be considered a group. So it's all about how do you want to cut the cake, essentially. And so this is how we're going to try to cut it. But there's many ways to cut the cake, but this is the way we're going to go. Now, here's the thing. And I've looked at a few other textbooks too, and the textbook does it here. When your textbook covers groups, it basically looks at groups from a task-oriented standpoint. So it's looking at groups that do stuff, like that do something, like, produce something, or, in a workplace that, finds something or solves a problem, or all of that. But what I want to do then is I want to kind of recognize that there are task-oriented groups, but there's also other kinds of groups that are not task-oriented. Now, what do I mean? Well, let's go back to the 3 general circumstances for social contact. We remember business, accident, and ceremony. And part of the issue is that the nature of a group is determined by the context by which it is formed. Okay? So the nature of the group is determined by the circumstances by which it comes together. So let's look at some circumstances. So remember business. So in business settings where a group has to come together to achieve a task, that's where you tend to get the more task-oriented group, right? Because it's formed for business purposes. So this is where you get those task force, committees, and any kind of group that is out to do something. And this is what your book mostly covers, it seems like. And a lot of other books, they tend to look at groups formed under these circumstances. Now, if there's going to be any kind of relationship building, it's going to be on a very limited circumstance, because remember, we try to keep our business impersonal, right? We try to keep it professional, and then we have personal and professional on a continuum, right? You got personal, and then you got professional, and part of life is figuring out where the balance is, on this little continuum, okay? So I'm using a different stylus today, so it's not as nice as the other one. Okay, so that's kind of the continuum there. Then you have accident. And when a group is formed accidentally, these are usually ad hoc groups, right? And they form temporarily to achieve a specific purpose. So where might this occur? All over the place. Let's say you are in an elevator in a group, in the elevator. So you and some people enter an elevator, okay? And you're in the elevator. Well, technically, you're a group, right? Or you're at least forming accidentally. And let's say the elevator gets stuck, and now you have to sit there and try to figure out what's going on. So now you've kind of become an ad hoc group, where now you're interacting with each other, and you're trying to get out of the elevator because you're stuck. But you weren't told that you had to do this, and it certainly wasn't by ceremony like you wanted to. It was all by accident that you became a group, because some kind of outside circumstance that you couldn't anticipate said that you had to work together quickly to get out of this situation. If you also think about, if you're on a plane and it crashes, so you think Lost, and then you form a group with all the survivors, that's an accident, right? It's a group formed by accident. You didn't have any prior history, so it's an accidental group. So usually when groups form under these circumstances, they're very ad hoc, and they're going to work temporarily to achieve that purpose, and then they're going to go back to whatever they did, okay? And then you have ceremony. And if you remember ceremony, these are your relational type groups. So if you make a friend, let's say you go to orientation and you meet somebody and they seem pretty cool and you're like, hey, we should hang out. Okay, cool. So now you and that person start hanging out and then you decide, hey, let's go to a party. All right. So you invite 2 other friends. Now you have a group of friends. You get into the same car. You guys maybe hang out at your house for while you get ready and all that stuff. Now you have a friend group, and that's from ceremony. And you're not trying to do anything in particular. You don't have a set task per se that you're trying to fulfill. You're just hanging out. So ceremony would make more of a relational type group. So bringing these back then, business, accident, and ceremony can already set the foundation for how the group is going to interact because of these circumstances. So if it's business, it's going to be very task-oriented. If it's accident, it's going to be very ad hoc. Okay, and I should just write that down. So ad hoc. And ceremony is going to be very relational, right? Because you're forming under the circumstances of friendship, sociality, and those kinds of things. So what I want to do is I want to draw a distinction between 2 kinds of groups. I want to draw a distinction between task groups and social groups. So task groups then are groups that are formed for purposes of fulfilling a set task. Okay, so there's a set task set before it. So juries, when you're doing jury deliberations, sales teams, sports teams, groups that have a particular goal. Social groups, it's all about sociality, okay? You form the group with no particular task in mind, but it's more phatic, okay? So sociality, phatic, okay? It's more just to hang out, to do fun stuff, to relate and be friends. So your friend groups would be a social group. Your family could technically be a social group. A fraternity or sorority could be a social group. Any kind of group where you're just relating to people and there isn't one task that we do. Now, the thing is that these 2 kinds of groups can overlap each other. So your friend group can go out and perform a task as a group, okay? So, maybe as your friend group, you guys go out hunting. Or maybe you call your friends and you're like, hey, let's build a shed. Or hey, let's go play World of Warcraft or Modern Warfare 4, that one, or whatever is the newest one, okay? So certainly your social group then can still perform tasks together. And certainly your work group can also become a friend group over time if interaction permits. So if you're working on a long project together and with your coworkers, but it's so involved that you guys kind of get to know each other as you do the project, you might become a friend group outside of work. So then there becomes a social element that overlaps the task element, and similarly there can be a task element that overlaps the social element. So you could have a group, a dual kind of group then, that kind of has both of these things. So we'll call that a dual kind group. But they don't necessarily have to be there. They don't necessarily have to overlap, but it can overlap. But there are certain complications that can occur when you have a dual kind group, okay? So the first is that your task performance can affect your standing in a social group. So your task can affect your social standing. And let's look at some examples here. So, for example, if your friend group likes to play basketball, okay, and you're terrible at it, complications might occur then when your friends want to play basketball, but they don't call you because you suck, right? Like, they're going to be like, well, we don't want to call you because when you play basketball, you just whine, or you just drop the ball, or you get the ball taken from you. So then you get upset because you're like, well, how come you guys don't invite me when you guys play basketball? Well, and so maybe they won't tell you that it's because you stink, but they'll come up with these other reasons. And so that affects your social standing in the, or your ability to uphold the task affects then your social standing. Because you can't play basketball very well, you're not called as much to go out and do fun things. Similarly, relationships in your social group can affect how you perform the task. So social relations can affect the task. And we can think of tons of examples of this. So if it's well known that in your work group that two people don't like each other, then we may try to avoid having certain conversation topics because the social relations, the tension, will make it hard for people to work together. Or if it's well known that two people are sleeping together in your group, that might create distrust for how the task gets upheld, because then you might feel fear for favoritism. So this is where complexities come up, and this is where much of life, our social life is trying to keep these separate, right? Trying to have it so that we can have great relationships without affecting how we perform our work. But the problem is that they can mutually affect each other, and that's where complications can occur. And so we have to navigate a lot of times this whole duality, if you will. Now, let's keep going. So here are the key concepts that are related to task groups that I want to mention for you to have. The first one is groupthink. And you might have heard of this before. Groupthink it's a negative kind of consensus seeking where members would rather have agreement than contradict the majority. So basically, the problem with groupthink is everyone is so geared, nobody wants to rock the boat, right? Nobody wants to be that guy, like you have a 9 out of 10 people are voting yes on that bill, but you're like, there's that one guy who has to say no, that kind of thing, and then people get mad because they think you're impeding the progress. Well, some people become so afraid of being that guy that when the group is making a bad decision, nobody says anything because they're afraid to, because they don't want to be the one guy who holds up everything, right? So that's called groupthink. Groupthink is the idea that people don't question themselves, or a group doesn't question the decisions it's making because it values consensus over dissensus, if you will. And so this is a possible unintended consequence of a concept in the Floyd book, which is called cohesiveness. Okay, and that's in your book. The other term I want you to be aware of is outgroups, or you can also call them factions. So a faction is a group within a group who feel disgruntled, under-recognized, or just a general lack of identification with the team. So like, let's say you have a group of 12 and they're on a committee, but maybe there's 3 or 4 people who just don't think that the majority is listening to them. So they come together and they form a faction where they talk about everything outside of the meeting, and they make plans and strategize and do all this stuff because they're just like, we're unhappy with the majority of the group. We think they're all crazy. And so then they start to form their own little group and make their own little decisions. And then to its extreme, they break away from the group and start their own if they can. Okay? If it gets to an extreme where they just feel completely isolated or alienated from the group. So when I was in a fraternity, I still am, I'm an alum, but when I was vice president of the fraternity, one of the things we had to do was we had factions in our fraternity, like because we just had very, very different guys in this group of 20 men. That was what was cool about our fraternity, was everybody was different, but that was also the problem. Everybody was different. So one of the things that I had to do as vice president was a lot of times we didn't make our decisions in meetings. Instead, I had to visit people individually in their rooms when they were playing video games or whatever and talk to them about things because it couldn't get done publicly. And that's where I had to deal with the factions, if you will, and try to figure out what it is that they wanted and how to get what they wanted, but while still getting what we wanted in the majority. So that's a lot what I did. I also worked in the Kansas legislature for a year as a legislative assistant. And yeah, most of the decisions that were made by my like representative who I was working for. I mean, well, for everybody in general, most of the decisions were made behind closed doors. Like the Senate floor and the representative floor, that's all just for show. Like people will kind of give their speeches, whatever, but everybody's already decided what they're going to do. And a lot of it's decided in meetings with the lobbyists or the special interest groups or with citizens and or within their party caucuses. So I got to sit in on party caucuses where the party would sit down and say, okay, here's where we think we're going to stand on this. Here's where we're going to vote here. You know, try to stay in line, people, because we need to be unified, all that stuff. But most of the time, the floor, the stuff you see on C-SPAN, it's more formality stuff. It's not, from everything from my experience and from what I've seen, most decisions are made outside of that floor. So, and that's to deal, and so most political decisions then are done in this informal dealing with factions, trying to figure out what people wanted, and then putting it on the floor for show. Okay, so probably more than what you want to know, but okay. Now, one thing you should learn is Tuckman's 5 stages of group development, which surprisingly is not in the book. I don't know why. I didn't pick the book, so that's one thing I want to say. All right, so one of the things is Tuckman's 5 stages of group development, and this focuses on task-oriented groups, so keep that in mind as you think about this. Okay, so we look at task groups. Now, what's nice about these 5 stages is that they kind of rhyme, which is cool. So you have forming, and this is where the group comes into existence and seeks direction from a leader about the nature of its task and its procedure. So the forming stage is the beginning, okay? So if you think about forming, let me see if I can draw this, okay? You got 4 little heads here, so that's number 1. So 4 little heads, everyone's coming together. Then you have storming. And in storming, the group determines its leader, okay? So there you go. The group has decided there is its leader. It's a group of 4. And in storming, it's also determining the roles of its members, too. In norming, the group establishes its procedures to move to a solution. So here, the group is figuring out how is it going to work to get things done, okay? And so you might have arrows. So you might say, Mark is going to be the guy who, I don't know, I'm trying to think of an example. Mark is going to be the guy who takes notes. Chris is going to be the guy who draws the picture. Steve is going to be the guy who describes the picture. And Jake, the leader, is going to present it, okay? So they're just determining their procedure. It's their action plan, essentially, or their norms for dealing with how they're going to implement the action. And then number 4 is the actual performing, okay? And that's where they execute their plan, okay? So now action, they've performed, and the little box is their product, okay? So in performing, they've executed, and they've eventually put in their product. And then number 5 is called adjourning, and basically, in adjourning, everybody goes about, well, first, the group reflects on itself, you know, looks at their achievements, looks at their accomplishments, and, you know, just reviews everything. Okay, here's how it went, here's how we think it went, and then everybody goes about their separate ways, okay? So that's adjourning. So forming, norming, performing, or excuse me, forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning. Okay, say that fast 10 times. Okay. Let's move on. Then the other one is the Fisher's model of group progression. And this one's more oriented to social groups. So here you have 4 phases. You have the orientation phase, where groups get to know one another and figure out, like, encounter the problems that they've convened to deal with. Okay, so I'm going to draw this one out. So here, everyone comes together and just kind of meets for the first time, right? And they're thinking about a problem. So we'll make the triangle the problem, okay? And then part 2 is conflict, and this is where the group argues and deliberates possible ways of approaching the problem and begins to seek solutions, okay? So here, I don't know how to draw this exactly. You know, the group's just kind of deliberate. Okay, so these are little thought bubbles. Okay, and this is a little cartoon. Sorry, I'm not using my good stylus. Okay, now they're all kind of deliberating the problem here, which is the triangle. Okay. Sorry, these look like aliens, but you know, aliens need group communication too, if they talk. Okay, and emergence. That'd be cool if aliens were watching this and then they're like, all right, okay. Anyways, emergence. So this occurs when daylight of consensus begins to dawn, okay? So the group sees, basically, a consensus is beginning to emerge, okay? Now they haven't said that there's a consensus, but essentially it starts to come out that it seems like people are agreeing. So eventually, you know, the consensus comes out and they're all starting to speak towards the same thing. Okay, so this is like a massive thought bubble. I know this is like really ugly. I almost should erase that. I'm going to erase this. Okay, I'm going to try this again. So basically what I'm trying to draw with my poor stylus is a big thought bubble that goes in the middle. Okay, so there's probably like some archangers that are just like shaking their heads right now. Like, dude, seriously? Okay. There you go. Massive thought bubble, okay? And they're still talking about the problem, but the thought bubble is coming together to deal with this problem, okay? And then fourthly, you have reinforcement, okay? And so here's the idea before I get to reinforcement. So your group comes together, they're like, okay, we have a problem. So then they're like, okay, well, here's how we can solve it. So this is stage 2, where, okay, so first, stage 1, we're here, we got a problem. Stage 2, okay, here are some ideas for how we can solve it. Eventually, you get to stage 3, where suddenly one idea starts to really catch value, right? One idea really starts to catch on with people. So, and you start to sense this, right? Because people are like, you know, we should just, have a massive party, and we can raise money for the new car or new ventilation system for our house. And then you might hear somebody say, yeah, party sounds pretty good, actually. Yeah, we could do this with a party, we could do that with a party. And someone was like, yeah, we could have Lord come and sing at our party, right? And then, like, you know, and then if you're like that fourth person, and maybe you're not sold on the party idea, but now you're starting to see in number 3 that there's an emergence, right? You're starting to see that there's a consensus coming. So that's where if you don't stand up for the contrary opinion, this is your chance to, this is your chance to say, hey, maybe this isn't a good idea. But if you're one of those people that you value consensus and all that, you probably won't say anything, and that's where things can go wrong. But then you have number 4, which is reinforcement, and this is where the group consolidates consensus, and they make it explicit that this is what it's going to be, and that this is what we're going to do, and then they convene. Okay, so I don't know, for number 4, with my poor drawings, they consolidate consensus. So they're like, yes, and it's established. So put an exclamation point there. It's established. All right, this is what we're going to do. We're going to do this, and we're done. Thank you, everybody. Have a nice day. So that's reinforcement. So those are the 2 models of group progression. And still, like, even with social groups, it's still very task-oriented. But what I like about Fisher's is that it kind of at least gives a nod to the idea of, like, there's conflict, there's orientation, there's kind of this relational, interpersonal aspect. For a lot of people, Tuckman is just too mechanical. Okay. Now, for social groups, there's just 2 things that I want to bring up here for social groups, and then we'll be done for today. One is stratification. Now, stratification, this is another complex sociological term that I'm going to try to simplify for our purposes. But once again, if you're interested in stratification, you can study sociology. Communication hits on it too, but I mean, it just depends on what you're interested in. But stratification is the tendency for people to form groups and establish a hierarchy within a society or closed institution. Okay, so the key ideas here is forming groups and what some would say a hierarchy. Now, a great example of stratification is high school. okay? So we all remember, however old you are, that in high school people formed groups. So you had all kinds of groups, right? You had the athletes, you had the plastics, if you watched Mean Girls, you had the Pokemon, Magic the Gathering people, okay? You had the ICP people who would wear the scary clown t-shirts and dye their hair, all these different colors people. You've had like the band geeks. I mean, I don't know, however your school like separated people formed groups, okay? And that's, for some people, that they would say that's human nature, that we just form groups, okay? Now, the other idea to stratification, though, is that often when these groups are put into a closed system, that they form a hierarchy, okay? Or at least a set of social relations between groups where certain people yield to others or don't get along with others or are friends with others. So, in high school, perhaps the hierarchy was the popular people always got voted homecoming king and queen, maybe the geeks got ones who got all the swirlies and the sand kicked in their face at recess or whatever. However your system was. But one of the ideas is that in a closed system especially, hierarchies tend to form. And another good example of this is in prison. So I taught military students who worked at the Fort Leavenworth disciplinary barracks. So if you were in the military and you committed a crime, you would go to the Fort Leavenworth disciplinary barracks. You don't go to a normal civilian prison. And so one time he was, the student I was teaching, he was a cook and at the prison. He was the quartermaster, so I don't want to demote him. He was a quartermaster. He was not a prisoner. He was, normal Army quartermaster. And anyways, one time in class he was talking about how they are hiring new cooks, and he's having to train all these new cooks for the prison. And somebody had asked him, like, so what does it take to become a cook there? And he's like, because they hire prisoners to be the cooks. And he was like, well, you can't, and he had like some rules, like, you can't, you have to know how to work with sharp weapons, you have to be on some level of trust. And then like one of the last things he listed was you can't be a sex offender. And I was just kind of weird. I was like, well, why does that matter? Because you're working with food. Why does it matter if you're a sex offender? And he was like, well, because if the prisoners know that a sex offender made their food, they won't eat it. And I was like, what? And he was like, yeah, in prison. If you think prison is like the scum of the earth, like all the prisoners are there, well, the scum of the earth, the scum of the earth are sex offenders. So like he was saying, like in prison, if people find out you're a sex offender, like you get bullied, and if you don't bully the sex offenders, people think you are, and so it's just like they have to kind of be in their own little group, and they have to fend for themselves, and it's not very easy for them. And then he was talking about too, like how in prisons it's very racial too, so you have to find a group, that's the idea, and you kind of have to stick with them. A lot of times it's by race too. So that's kind of, and prison is a closed system, so of course they're going to have that kind of stratification. But so I just thought that was really interesting, and so don't break the law, people. Okay. And then you have co-groups. So co-groups is the presence of other groups in an environment. Now, there are three that I want to identify, okay? So when you're a social group, you're going to be usually a group within a larger system. Now, in college, the reason college isn't like high school is college is too big, number one. And number two, it's not as closed, it's not as much of a closed system as high school. Because college people come and leave. There isn't a central gathering place in college like there is in a prison or in a high school. And then, you have wide ranges of age and, socioeconomic status. It's not high school where everyone's within 4 years of each other. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why it's not. And plus, people are just more mature. People are kind of sick of it. But you still have co-groups, though, in any kind of social group. So co-groups can be other groups that are in the environment. So one might be rivalries, okay? So rivalries. And rivalries are groups that compete with you. So in sports, that would be, the other teams. maybe for fraternities and sororities, the other fraternities and sororities are rivalries, right? Because you're competing for the same resources, right? Which in this case would be the best students or the most studious students or whatever. So they're technically a rivalry. Now, you don't have to necessarily be petty to each other when you're a rivalry, but it's just that there are certain decisions you make and there's certain things that you can't do with the fraternity because it's against your own interests, or with other fraternities and sororities because it's against your own group's interests. Then you have alliances. And alliances are groups who work with you to fulfill your interests. So they're groups that kind of have similar interests towards you, but or it's in their interest for you to get your interests. So like fraternity and sororities can be allies, even though, so fraternities are rivalries with each other, but a fraternity and a sorority can be an alliance because they don't compete for the same people, because sororities compete for women, fraternities compete for men. So they can work together to help each other recruit, but it's rare when you see two fraternities try to recruit off of each other if they're going for the same guys. Then you have bystanders. And these are people who don't have any dog in the fight. Like, they have interests, but they're non-competitive with yours, and they're basically just kind of irrelevant, right? So if you're in a fraternity, the science club is probably a bystander. Like, they don't probably affect you in any way, but they're just another group out there, but you don't feel threatened by them, and you don't feel that they're an advantage to you either. So this is very subjective according to the group, and of course all of this needs a little bit more development, at least on this side. But the idea is that when you're in a closed system and you're in a social group, these things tend to get a little bit more exaggerated. But in a more open system like college, maybe it's not as pronounced. But for sure, you do have some kind of stratification going on, especially in a closed system, like a school, a prison, a company even too, if there's competition there. Otherwise, that's it for today. Next time, we're going to go over focus gatherings, and we're going to be working our way up towards running meetings and eventually some group communication. So, more group communication, but you'll see. All right, talk to you soon.